Hello and welcome to Ethics. We're going to be studying from the textbook Ethical Dilemmas and Decisions in Criminal Justice, and these PowerPoints are going to be narrated mostly. I'm going to discuss some of the slides from time to time. Some of the slides won't have any commentary, so you should be able to pause this recording as you need to, and as we go through some slides that don't have any commentary, you can stay with those as long as you need to and then continue the recording. So we're going to start in Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is Morality, Ethics, and Human Behavior. So talking about chapter objectives for Chapter 1, really one of the biggest things to be covered in this chapter is to discuss and be able to apply the difference between ethical issues and ethical dilemmas, and then to really note how throughout the course of various professions within the criminal justice system there are numerous opportunities to use discretion, and therefore the role of ethics is just critical in terms of that decision-making process, everything from law enforcement to the court system, be it defense lawyers, prosecutors, judges, and then into the correction systems as well. Numerous opportunities for discretion to come into play, and so it is critical that we identify the ethical structures that we're going to be using to make those decisions. So let's break this down a little bit more. Ethical issues versus ethical dilemmas. Ethical issues are really kind of big picture questions. The text calls them broad social questions. It's major moral issues that we face, and some of the latest have been whether it's appropriate to take funding away from police departments and divert it to other social service programs. Decriminalizing drug use, specifically marijuana, is a big ethical issue. What do we do about the death penalty? Should we continue to use the death penalty? How do we deal with problematic police officers? What do you do with people who are here in this country illegally? Those are big ethical issues, and then that's versus ethical dilemmas. And ethical dilemmas are really where you have to apply your thinking on ethical issues. You have to apply your ethical critical thinking on ethical issues and actually make decisions in particular situations. It could be anything from, does an officer issue a citation, to does a police chief fire a problematic officer? Does a prosecutor disclose certain information? Does a defense attorney raise a certain issue at trial? How does a jailer deal with someone who is offering him even the most minimal of a bribe? Those are ethical dilemmas that have to be resolved by people within the criminal justice system. So the previous several slides talked about why we study ethics in general, but then we really start to focus on why it is critical for criminal justice professionals. The previous slide, and we've already talked about the use of discretion that comes in at all levels of the criminal justice system. But each professional within the justice system has a unique responsibility and role when it comes to enforcing the law. And the text really talks about two fundamental constitutional safeguards. One is due process and one is equal protection. And at multiple levels, each professional has an opportunity to exercise discretion, to make ethical judgments, to resolve ethical dilemmas in a way that affects both of those fundamental constitutional protections, due process and equal protection. Due process is essentially what holds government in check. Remember, the criminal justice system grants unto public servants the authority to take away somebody's life, liberty, and property. Basically, you have the opportunity to put somebody in jail, to fine them, to take away their property, and you ultimately have the opportunity to take away their life through capital punishment. And so it's important that a proper process is followed each and every time, and that the hands of government are restricted so that it doesn't overreach. And that comes into play specifically through individual decision making, starting at legislators and police officers enforcing the law, members of the court system applying the law, and then members of the corrections system actually holding people in confinement and supervising them as well. And the text notes that all of these people are public servants. Basically, they're paid with public dollars, and so they're held to a higher standard, and they have higher expectations placed upon them that they are to make ethical decisions and make right decisions each and every time. The text identifies these ethical principles that the Josephson Institute talks about, and in part of their training they say that these principles should govern all public servants, and so we should go through those real quick. The fact is, one, that it is public service, that someone is either elected or appointed to that position, be they a legislator or a law enforcement officer or a prosecutor or a public defender or a judge or a prison guard or a jail guard or a probation officer or a parole officer. These are all positions of public service, and essentially it is a public trust. It is important that everyone in these positions operate so that they are free from any conflict of interest. In other words, they're required to exercise discretion in making those decisions. They can't be improperly swayed one way or the other by outside influences. They're also accountable. The processes that they use to make these decisions have to be transparent. That's a word that's used a lot, but essentially the public needs to know the process that's used each and every time. They also have to follow the law, both in letter and in spirit. And finally, the public has to have trust in the decisions that these public servants make. There's this idea of avoiding even the appearance of impropriety. The Institute calls it respectability. For the criminal justice system to work effectively, it has to maintain public confidence, and that is essential that each of these public servants avoid even the appearance of impropriety. So why then specifically should criminal justice professionals study ethics? And I should add, study ethics early on. Well, for one thing, everyone should strive to be more professional, but more importantly, it's critical that professionals in the justice system develop critical thinking skills, and this is really something that has to be done at the beginning or at the outset. It's kind of like professional sports, the Olympics, military exercises, marathons. Nobody jumps into those and just takes part in those right away. They go through a process of training, and training the most fundamental exercises and conditioning and developing skills so that at critical times they're able to react almost instinctively, and they're able to react without having to go through this process and without having to go back to the basics each time. That's why we also study ethics beforehand, so that we develop these skills, identify our weak areas, and develop the tools so that we can consistently resolve ethical dilemmas. Another warning is that the criminal justice system is really about government exercising authority and power over the citizens which it governs, which inherently means it's subject to abuse. And so it's critical that professionals in the justice system study ethics so that they don't fall prey to abusing power themselves, and they also can identify it when it's happening by somebody else, and they can act to prevent it. In distinguishing morals and ethics, it's important to know that very often we use these words interchangeably. Morals is just what is deemed to be a good conduct, and ethics is essentially the same thing, although it's studied more, and when we use the term ethics, it's most often in the context of a profession. And just expounding on a few more of these terms, this idea of applied ethics is really, when it comes to resolving ethical dilemmas, this is what it looks like when actual criminal justice professionals encounter these dilemmas in the real professional world and they put this training to use. And then this other term, professional ethics, the text talks about it relating to a specific profession. The judges have a code of judicial conduct. Lawyers have professional responsibility rules that apply to them as well. Jailers have the Commission of Jail Standards that governs their conduct as well. So each subsection of the criminal justice system has a code of professional ethics that applies to that particular discipline. So let's look at this idea of duties in a little more detail. Duties themselves are basically the bottom line, the baseline. It's the minimum that professionals are expected to perform to be considered moral or to be considered ethical. And then this term supererogatories are essentially ethical actions that are above and beyond one's duty. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. There was no requirement that he stop and act, but he did. It was beyond his ethical duty. It was a supererogatory. And then there's this idea of imperfect duties. It's these fundamental concepts of generosity and honesty and truthfulness that everyone should hold, but it's not exactly clear how you always specifically apply that to particular situations. The text spends some time talking about values and moral judgments, and so it defines values as elements of desirability, worth, or importance. And the fact is that each person has different values, and a person's collection of values make up their value system. The conflict comes in when these various values that we hold to come into conflict, and then we have to decide, well, which value is more important than the other. And in speaking about values, we have to be careful that we're not talking about factual judgment of conduct. In other words, a factual judgment is to say that a person is lying about something or that this other thing happens to be true. But value judgments are describing somebody as a good person or describing a decision as a better decision with respect to something else. Some of the writers don't really distinguish between value judgments and moral judgments, but for our purpose, it is important for a number of reasons. One, the text has this exercise where there are, I think, 20 different values that they list, and they suggest that you spend some time looking through these values and rank them in terms of priority. There's values everything from achievement to physical appearance, to love, to power, to wealth and wisdom. And so a person's value system is going to require that they make a determination about which of those values take priority over another. And then the text also notes that we need to be careful not to confuse values and morals, because values talk about relative importance of issues, but morals actually drill down to govern our behavior. Morals prescribe or proscribe behavior. In other words, morals dictate what we should do and also what we should not do. The text talks about making moral judgments. A couple of important things here. One is that we have morals and we have values, but when those morals compel us to act based on our relative value system, those actions then are the things that are regarded as right or wrong. Our actions based upon our value system and our morals cause us to commit conduct that then is evaluated in terms of whether it's ethical or not. The text also notes that not all behaviors, not all actions, let me change that, not all behaviors are necessarily subject to ethical analysis. In other words, somebody's belief isn't considered ethical or not. It could be a disagreement about values or morals, but it has to be an action. There has to be conduct to determine whether it is ethical. Also, ethics applies only to human acts. We don't evaluate the conduct of animals based on ethics because they're not rational beings. Another applies to people using their free will. By that, someone who is young or outside the age of accountability, that's a term that's used sometime, or someone who is insane cannot have their conduct subjected to ethical analysis. It has to be an act of their free will. And finally, we judge conduct that affects others. Even if it affects our own lives in a way that causes effect on somebody else's life, it's conduct that affects others that is subject to ethical analysis. The text also spends some time guiding us through this process of analyzing ethical issues and policies, and it lays out these various questions that we should ask ourselves in terms of going through this process of critical thinking. And it talks about the fact that that's really an overused term, and it is, but the idea is that when we're analyzing a situation, when we're analyzing an ethical issue or a policy, we need to be careful that we focus on facts as opposed to vague concepts or our underlying biases or assumptions that we might make. This idea of using critical thinking means that we are trying to be as objective as possible in analyzing this and looking at whether decisions are ethical or not, and being careful that we don't let our personal biases or assumptions come into play. And then finally in this chapter, the text has this brief overview of analyzing ethical dilemmas. This is, like we mentioned earlier, where the rubber meets the road. This is where you're faced with two courses of action or more, and the right answer doesn't immediately present itself. That's an ethical dilemma where all of our values and concepts now come into play and we have to make a decision. So the steps suggested by the text are: first, identify the facts. Make sure that we know all of the facts involved, and then think about the values that come into play, the relative values that are important to you as the decision maker. Next is identify the dilemmas, the decisions that have to be made, and then prioritize basically what the next step is. What's the most immediate dilemma, the most immediate decision that has to be made between these two or more courses of action. And then inherently in doing that, we're going to be considering where we stand on these various ethical issues. And this will come into a lot clearer picture as we go through this process in subsequent chapters. And then finally, resolve the ethical or moral dilemma by using an ethical system or some other means of decision making. And this is what we talked about earlier, meaning this is something that you train for. It's something that we practice and that we be prepared to do within the profession of the criminal justice system, really, or any other profession as well. Now, we need to be preparing for events like this, knowing that we will face ethical dilemmas, essentially deciding what do we believe, right? Not so much what do we believe, but what do you believe? What do I believe? What ethical system do we subscribe to? And it could be more than one. And be comfortable with that and be ready to use that as a framework when it comes time to resolve ethical dilemmas in the profession.